Sometimes, oh, I've lost one already. Sometimes it makes me kind of sad sometimes when I think that Jesus might not have had a dog. Jesus should have had a dog. Everybody should have had, okay, even a cat or a hamster, gerbils, budgie, I don't know. Jesus should have had a pet. I talk about these guys all the time, these dogs all the time. In fact, 2 weeks ago, I was talking about how they welcome people, and they each have their own way. And sometimes they also have their own way of telling you that they've had enough of you and they're moving on. They have their own toys, they have their own personalities. I like to tell stories about them. Jesus never tells any stories about dogs or cats or budgies or hamsters or pets or anything like that. But he tells a lot of stories about things like seeds and soil. He tells a lot of stories about fish. He tells stories about farming. He tells stories about people who farm or have vineyards, right? They grow grapes and stuff. And I always used to think just that Jesus was doing that because he thought the people he was talking to would understand better. If he told them a story, they'd understand better. But that's a little one-sided, I think. And I think one of the reasons Jesus tells the stories he does, the way he does, isn't just the people who are listening, it's because it's what he knows. I know, right away, I know you're thinking, but okay, Jesus, before he was a minister and a teacher, he was a carpenter, so why doesn't he tell more carpentry stories? Why doesn't he tell more building stories? There's just that one about the house built on rock and the house built on sand, right? Why doesn't he tell more stories about construction? That's fair. But maybe he's trying to tell stories that not only he thinks people will connect because they know it, but it's something he's familiar with. So it's both those things together. See, I think we don't know any of the stories about Jesus between when he was about like 12 and when he started his ministry, right? So he could have worked on a farm. Growing up, he probably lived in a little town, in a little community where people grew their own food. So he'd know a little something about soil and dirt and seeds and stuff. He knew something about sheep, obviously. He talked about sheep and goats and things like that. He knew enough about fishing to talk to fishermen and say, hey, come with me and it'll be just like when you're fishing. It wasn't, and that's the thing is that when Jesus tells a story, it's not just telling it so you can hear it. He wants to make sure you heard him. What he wants is for you to make sure that you heard him telling you the story. And so he's going to also tell you about something that maybe has been an experience of his or something he knows something about. And that's the thing is I think Jesus really wants us to tell our stories. Jesus, and you know what? That takes a lot of bravery. That takes a lot of courage to tell your story sometimes. Sometimes it's hard to tell your story and talk about yourself. Sometimes it's hard to understand stories of other people who've had experiences that you haven't had, that they've done things that you haven't. Sometimes it's in the telling of the story. Jesus sometimes told stories where he'd say things like, listen, and then he'd tell a story. And you know, it wasn't that kind of listen that, you know how when you do something that you're pretty much sure you shouldn't have done, and one of your parents or an adult or somebody in authority goes, listen, it's not like that. What Jesus is trying to do is connect. He's trying to make sure that you understand the story he's telling you comes from him. So you get to connect with Jesus. So when you tell a story to somebody, you're not just telling them a story to entertain them. You're not just telling them a story so they'll know something. They'll know something about you. And that takes a lot of courage and a lot of bravery. That's why Jesus so frequently tells people to not be afraid. It's not just about the experiences that you have, it's about the telling of your experience too, and how important it is to do that. That's a hard thing sometimes. It's important to remember, as Jesus always reminds us, that God is with us. And the best way for us to share God, to share in God, and to share with each other is to be able to connect. We can't do that if we don't tell our stories. So we're going to hear a story today that's about seeds and soil and the different places that seeds can end up and how well they'll grow in those different places and things. How would you tell that story? We're gonna tell it a couple of different ways in a minute, but I wonder how you'd tell this story. Would it be about seeds and soil? Would it be about puppies or pets, your friends? How would you share a story? The very first hymn we had this morning, Ben, thanks to Ben for doing that. That song's a story. That's a way to say, in fact, that's another way. I don't just talk about my dogs. Sometimes I talk about music, or we share a song, because that's another way to tell a story. That first hymn we sang with Ben tells a story. In fact, there's a story behind why Ben was singing that hymn. In fact, there's a story for me about that hymn too. See how all of those things connect when we share our stories. And we can do that even just by singing a song that reminds people of stories.